Welcome to the National Women's Fitness Academy podcast. We're here to talk about women's health, female hormones, body image, and all things health and fitness.
Hello, girls, and welcome back to another episode of the Women's Fitness Academy's podcast. I'm your host, Siggy, and if you haven't done already, please use the subscribe button so you don't miss out on another podcast. And if you're out there and you love this podcast, then you're most likely going to love our YouTube videos as well that we put out there for extra tips, extra entertainment. So make sure that if you're wanting to improve yourself, subscribe over there too. So, guys, I want to welcome you, Jade Walker, who is a naturopath based in Victoria, Melbourne, Geelong. I can't even remember. We literally just spoke about that, who provides support for women who have endometriosis and many, many things about fertility. And we're literally going to be diving deep into today's conversation about all women stuff. So, Jade, thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on. And you know what? I probably threw you because I am in Geelong, but I just mentioned how when I practiced in Melbourne. So it was probably like, oh, hang on a sec, which one was it? So yeah, Victoria, we'll just say.
I love it. Australia base. Jade, let's start from the beginning. I want to hear about your endo journey and how it led you to helping women with endo these days.
Yeah. So I got my period when I was 11, and it wasn't long after that I started to experience quite debilitating period pain. And this is a common story for a lot of people with endo, that they just experienced a lot of really severe period pain. You'd go to the doctor, get given Ponstan, or God forbid, being put on the pill from a really young teenager. And then also just constantly gaslit into believing that you're just a woman, you have to put up with this. This is what you're meant to go through. And that was my life for a long, long time. And it wasn't until I was about 19 or 20 and, I just experienced this really, really severe period. So I had this really bad period and I was in absolute agony while I was still living at home, and mum, it actually led to calling an ambulance because the pain is that full on. It is absolutely hectic. And so she said, I think it's time that you demanded some investigation. So I went back to my GP, and again, he was like, remember, you are a woman, you do experience period pain. I'm like, this is off the charts. I called an ambulance because I felt like I was dying. And he reluctantly, I had to really force him to write me a referral to a gynecologist. And even the gynecologist wasn't even any more helpful. She also just laughed at me. It was like, you probably don't have endometriosis. That's not what it sounds like. And I'm like, well, what is it then? Like, what if that's not endo, what is? And and this is going back 12, 13 years ago now. And anyway, I demanded to have a laparoscopy, and she was like, all right, well, we can do it. But even if we do find endo, we'll have to burn it off. And that can also lead to infertility, which that's one thing that she was correct about, because the technique she's referring to is called ablation, which is burning it off. And we, in the endo community, we really, really advocate for looking for an excision surgeon and making sure they don't use ablation, because that is not what we want to do for endo, because it can lead to further problems, and it also doesn't actually remove it at the root. You'll need more subsequent surgeries. So anyway, she was correct about that. But I had the surgery and wake up and she said, good news, no endo found. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I don't know what it is then. But I went on for the next 9 years in having debilitating period pains and still not knowing what the hell was going on. And it wasn't until I started studying naturopathy, my Bachelor of Health Science, that a lot of my lecturers, when it was coming to reproductive medicine lectures, when it came to severe dysmenorrhea, which is period pain, they kept saying you should investigate endometriosis. It's often a cause of debilitating pain. I was like, all of these symptoms keep matching up, especially also things like painful sex and painful bowel movements with your period and other pelvic pain conditions. And the next barrier, though, that I faced was everyone was saying, okay, you have to see a endosurgeon, someone who is actually qualified in this area. But I was under this belief that you had to have private health. And I was a broke uni student then. So I didn't have the money to see these really expensive surgeons. But this is also something that I've become a really strong advocate for and helped a lot of people to get that diagnosis, even through public healthcare, is that there are actually some endosurgeons that are available through public. So that's something I really, really want to get across to anyone listening to this. Do not let that be a barrier to you to be able to get diagnosed. It absolutely should not be a barrier. Anyway, but I kept going on for a couple more years with this idea in my mind that I couldn't afford to see a good endosurgeon. And finally, I got in the hands of a public surgeon, Dr. Russell Dalton. He's in regional Victoria. And literally within like the first 10 minutes of the appointment with him, he actually did a transvaginal ultrasound and had a little feel around. And he's like, oh, yeah, I can see some endo there. You can see there, it's like this thickening around the uterosacral ligaments. And I was like, oh, my God, like after 17 years of not knowing what the hell's going on and being gaslit, and now someone's just told me like that, just like that. And I just remember bawling my eyes out and just saying, I can't believe someone has finally listened to me. And he was so beautiful and nurturing. And so I've sent so many people to him and they all say the same thing. He's got beautiful bedside manner. And it was just from that moment forward, I just walked out of there like, that's it. This is what I'm dedicating my life to. And you know, even as a naturopath, even though the big thing is to help people to reduce their symptoms, get better quality of life, reduce their pain, bloating, all those things, one of the big elements of what I do and what my team also do is actually become a patient advocate and help them get the right diagnosis, like help them to see the right surgeon and get it sooner, and bypass all the shit that I did. So that's my story in a nutshell. I try and shorten it every time I tell it now, but yeah, that would be it.
It's first of all, thank you so much for sharing that. And it is so frustrating, especially as a women's health coach, to hear how so many times you had been gaslit, been told that there's nothing wrong with you. Yes, you may have the symptoms, but you know, just move on with life. And then you get another second opinion or multiple opinions, and then eventually come across the doctor and gives you the answers straight away. And you're like thinking to yourself, well, I wasn't crazy. I knew something was fucking wrong, but no one was able to give me the answers. And I think there's such a powerful aspect to this as women as well, because we know our fucking bodies. We know when something's wrong, and when something's right, you know, everything's fucking amazing. So it's frustrating because I'm sure you still see this on a day-to-day basis with your clients.
Yeah, it's honestly, I don't know how I'm still continuously being surprised. Like I thought it would have been better by now, and it is slowly getting better, but I still get people, whether it's a new patient, whether it's one of my naturopath's patients, whether it's someone who DMs me on Instagram, if it's someone in my endo Facebook group, every single week, same shit all the time. Oh, my doctor doesn't think it's this, or my doctor told me to go on the pill, or even, God forbid, they do end up in the wrong hands, like, you know, just someone who doesn't know how to look for all forms of endo, and they did have surgery. And I can tell straight away now, based on certain things that general gynecologists do in their surgeries compared to advanced trained excision surgeons do in their surgeries. Straight away, for example, I'll be like, did they provide you with any photos? Oh, no. I'm like, do you know what the name of your surgeon is? Oh, I don't think they told me. Things like that. I'm like, well, they weren't an advanced trained excision surgeon, because they are all over that and they make sure that you have all the information. And I'm like, okay, did you have ablation or excision? And if they had ablation, like they often tell me, oh, I don't know, no one explained that to me. But if they have excision, they're like, yeah, no, it was excision surgery, you know, like they know. So there's like those key differences. And so I'm just still seeing it every single week. And unfortunately as well, particularly in some regional areas. So I grew up in South Australia, in regional SA, and even now it sounds like it has not changed a bit. You know, everyone is still experiencing the same really poor, limited healthcare. And for some reason, it's like the education doesn't reach out to them on like what's changed and what's updated. And so they're still experiencing what I experienced there 15 years ago. It's like, this is just not good enough. Like so many people. And I say people too, because even though typically we associate endo as being a women's condition, it does actually affect all genders. So they've now found endo in males as well. But at the same time, we also use inclusive language to, also factor in those who are transgender and things like that. So, people with endo are often just going along for years and years and years unknowingly that they've got endo because they've been made to think that it's not. The other thing that really pisses me off, though, is this whole thing where people are made to feel like the pain's all in their head. Even if that kind of severe pain is in their head, don't you think they still deserve to be acknowledged anyway? Like, if someone is experiencing such a visceral response to something that's happening in their head where they are doubled over on the floor feeling like someone just stabbed them in the pelvis, I think we should probably still pay attention to that, don't you think? Like, if someone's still turning up in ED in debilitating pain, we need to pay attention. I actually posted a video in my Instagram story yesterday. I think I shared it, of this girl waking up from her endo surgery, and she was just so emotional. She's like, so it's not all in my head? I do have endometriosis. And it's like, yeah, it's definitely not all in your head. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is heartbreaking. And as you mentioned, the health industry is taking, a positive step forward. However, there's still a long way to go. You mentioned a couple of things around the pain for those who experience endo. And I know I have a couple of girlfriends who severely have, painful periods around that time of the month due to having endo. However, you also mentioned around having painful sex and then painful bowel movement during that time. I want us to dive into that because I don't think that's spoken openly enough around that.
Yeah, this is a huge topic that I'm very passionate about talking openly about and trying to destigmatize it, get more people to talk about it. So definitely painful sex is a real classic sign with endometriosis, particularly if it's that what's referred to as lateral parametrial endometriosis, which is the type I had. So it's dependent on the location. And if there is endo around, say for me, it was on the uterosacral ligaments, then when you're having sex, that is directly impacting that area. So actually it feels like when you're having sex, that deep penetration, you're like bracing yourself and you're like, oh my God, stop. It can be quite painful. And then what also happens over time is because of that constant bracing and tensing, you get overactive pelvis on top. So that creates even more pain and tension. And so we always refer people to pelvic physios or even pelvic osteos that can actually perform internal work so that they can, just in the same way we would get a massage on our body for tense muscles, we can get a massage inside our vagina to help to release some of that tension and do certain exercises at home, using dilators and things like that too. So there are a variety of things that we can do there. One thing for me that I realized not until later on that was also a sign of endo is that I used to actually get what felt like period pain induced by an orgasm because of, we know that the clitoris extends much larger than just that external clitoris that most people see. And so when after an orgasm with all that contracting, it can create spasms in the pelvis as well. I used to sometimes have an orgasm and be doubled over for like a good half an hour in the fetal position because I would have so much tension. But interestingly, as I started to do a lot of work, especially with all the naturopathic stuff, I just didn't experience them anymore. And I almost had forgotten about it. And I was like, oh yeah, I used to experience really bad cramping after my orgasm. The other one, and we'll touch on bowel movements in a sec, but the other one as well is also exercise-induced period pain too. I used to say if I would be working with a personal trainer or I'd go and do a spin class or something, and if I dived into that high intensity too fast, I'd be like, I've got to come off, I've got to leave. I'm like about to break out into severe pain. So I still remember this one time I was working with a personal trainer and I think he was making me sprint up and down these grass hills and things. And the next thing I was like, oh, I've got to stop. And I sit down on the grass and then I'm just bent over in agony. And he's like, this does not seem normal. I think you need to get this investigated. And this was like when I was a student. And again, I was just like, no, I've already had a laparoscopy. I know it's not endometriosis, And then also another time, when I did this spin class, and thank God it was like at the gyms when they have the virtual ones where it's just on the screen, and I was the only one in it, thank God. And I had to lay on the floor for half an hour in this room because I was in agony from it. So you can work with a pelvic physio on that though, and that can really help. But the painful bowel movements is another one. And just today, actually, I saw Tammin Sursok, who's very well known. She was originally an Australian actor, and she's got over 1 million followers, and she always posts really funny, relatable videos. But I saw one today, and she, just making a little bit of a laugh and a joke about when you've got your period and you're chatting to someone, and suddenly you get that sharp pain up the rectum with your period. And I even noticed a few people like, honey, this can be a sign of endometriosis. You might want to get that looked into. And I thought this is a really good point, because this, again, is one of those things that people just palm off as, oh, it's just my period. It's like, oh, that could actually be endo as well. And so a lot of people do notice just in that, week leading up to that period and throughout that period, they will start to experience, it can be even just like sharp stabbing pains up the rectum as well. So yeah, endo comes with a lot of different symptoms that people may not have actually associated with endo.
It's wild to think how people just normalize that. They don't think to investigate. They're just like oblivious. Oh yeah, it's just period pain. It's part of, being a human to experience this. It's just like, no, like there's a reason why this is happening.
Absolutely. And again, times are changing. There's more awareness. People are becoming more aware of it. But unfortunately, where it really needs to improve is at that first stop with the GP. And it is nowhere near as good as it needs to be. You are basically lucky if you go see a GP who is all over those symptoms. But a lot of the time, it's just like, okay, well, we could try this pain relief and we could try putting on the pill. Let's see how that goes. And it's like, no, let's save them several years of pain and frustration, and it also getting worse in that time and contributing to infertility and then all these other issues as well. Let's send them let's send them straight to an excision surgeon right now and get it sorted out.
Why don't you think they don't do that? Why do they still lean into the path of going on the pill or some form of birth control instead of actually going, hey, let's refer you out to a surgeon?
So I don't think it's their fault. I think it's just that it is the level of education that still hasn't filtered down. With that said, look, there are definitely some GPs that might at the very least refer them to a gynecologist. I think that is definitely improving, but they need to have a list of the top endosurgeons. Every single GP needs to have that, because that's another issue, is they're being sent to the wrong kind of gynecologist. With that said, one thing that is improving, if they get sent to a gynecologist, sometimes that gyno might realize it sounds like endo. I'm going to refer you off to an endo gynecologist who's better for you. But again, though, you're still paying for that gyno appointment that wasn't best for you, or you're still, though, at risk of them being like, oh, yeah, well, we can do a laparoscopy, but they're not as trained and skilled in picking up endometriosis. And I really want to highlight, this is not to doubt or, downplay how amazing all gynecologists are, because obviously they have done a lot of education and training to get there. But just in the same way a GP isn't a specialist in oncology or rheumatology or whatever, a gynecologist, a general gynecologist isn't across every single reproductive condition in the most nuanced way either. And an advanced trained excision surgeon in endometriosis has done several years of extensive further education, and obviously just looking at endo every single day and doing these different surgeries. And that's the thing that they've noticed now is that there are so many different forms of endo, and particularly in my type of endo, no wonder it's missed, because even when I looked at the photo, I was like, that barely looks different to me, that they can see it. So it really just has to be about having more resources that every single GP is given. Okay, this is the flow chart of events. When someone comes in with this cluster of symptoms, this is the type of surgeon that they get referred to, and that's how it should go.
Mm-mm. Yeah, it's something that a lot of people need to continuously investigate and not just fall down to the one way that they're being given, and really like get the second opinion like you did, just for the many years that you thought something was wrong with you, but you got told there wasn't, and then one day it just clicked and you're like, this is why.
Yeah, and I've got a couple of great examples here of what happened to me in these scenarios too, where when I finally decided I wanted to get investigated, I was just seeing a general GP, and he was really like supportive when I said, I would like to investigate endometriosis again. And he was like, yeah, no, for sure. That sounds like a good idea. But then it was met with, do you know what gynecologist you want to see? Do you have any in mind? So it then was all of a sudden up to me to know. And because he didn't have that list. And at that time, I didn't know about advanced trained excision surgeons. And so he looked up some gynos and he's like, I think this gyno's a good one. I'll refer you to her. And so I went and see this gynecologist, and she was amazing. She was super supportive and really listened to me, but she specialized in oncology, so cancer. And she even said, she's like, look, I'm not the right gyno for you, but while you're here, we might as well do a colposcopy. It's always good, which can look for if there's any abnormal cells. And so we did that. And because it was through a private appointment, that's not covered, where you can usually get a covered colposcopy. And so this appointment cost me $450 for like 15 minutes to get a referral to a gynecologist, a different one. And so it's little things like that it's just frustrating, because I could have saved time, money, energy by, again, being put in the right hands. And it was only because of being a naturopath, being in the space that I'm in, and speaking to a couple of the right people that made me realize about this term, advanced trained excision surgeon in endometriosis. And then I ended up in this Facebook group for Victorian people with endometriosis, and I started doing a search in there, and that's how I came across the surgeon that I ended up going with. And then I was like, wow, like that was actually really easy once I knew how to do it. But for some reason, it's coming across as one of the most hardest processes for people to have to experience. So much so that I ended up creating this whole document that I've committed hours and hours and hours to over the last few years of building it out. That's completely free. Anyone can access it in my Facebook group called Natural Medicine for Endometriosis. It's in the files section. And it's of all the top surgeons in Australia for endometriosis. And I've even outlined the exact process from start to finish on how you go get your referral, what you need to ask for, how you book that appointment, usually how long it takes, even put in the average cost to be expected, public versus private, the pros and cons, because all those things would have helped me so much if I had had them much sooner.
That is so wonderful to hear, because again, like you said, like you had to go through this process on your own, get referred to someone who was, not in the specific diagnosis that you were after, and then just wasting time and more time and more time. So I love how you've now come to take it upon you to help other women not to go through what you had to go through.
Yeah, and that's also why I wanted to bring on more naturopaths as well who have endometriosis too, because at the end of the day, we get it on much a deeper level if we've been through it ourselves. And that's why I brought on Emmy and Alex, because they both have endometriosis. And so I wanted to create a bit of a team, because also there's only so many people I can see. And that's also why I wanted to create the Endo Care Collective, which is my new endo course, because I wanted to make it more accessible to people. All the information that I teach people when they see me one-on-one, I want anyone to be able to access that. And so like this, so many people have already said to me, wow, I can't believe how much value is in this course, because I've put just about everything I know in there, and then some, when it comes to helping people, whether it be with their their symptoms, their diet, their lifestyle, everything that can improve people's quality of life with endo. And so that leads me on to my next passion, is that there's all, obviously we've just touched on all the stuff that's really, pisses us off about how there's so many gaping holes in the medical system when it comes to endo. But the next thing is, okay, you've been diagnosed with endo or you've had your excision surgery. Now what? Do you just go on still doing all the things? Because most people still come to me and say, I'm still in pain. I thought that was meant to fix me. And it absolutely is, in my opinion, paramount. I always encourage everyone to get surgery if possible, because we need to have those lesions removed because they're inflammatory and all these things. But there are still processes that are occurring in the body that are exacerbating your symptoms. And we need to work on that. And there's so much we can do. And there are things that both the research is now showing as well as that, as clinicians, we do also see things that there isn't a lot of solid research for yet, but I'm seeing it day in, day out with my patients that I know works. So you're combining both what you're seeing and what also the evidence says as well. So it kind of, everything I do, it's a bit of a niche way of working with endo that I have created over the last 7 years of practicing. And I see it a lot of people were even getting better results than even I got when working on my own self. And some people were like, oh, I had a pain-free period. I didn't need to take anything. I'm like, I couldn't even do that. How did I get you to do that? And I couldn't do it for myself. But this is the thing with endo too. Everyone responds differently to different things. And because endo is a whole body disease, it's been found on every organ in the body. It's been found on the brain, on the spinal cord, in the lungs, in the knees. It's been found everywhere. And, this is another thing to point out, is that endometriosis, for a long time, people used to say it's growth of the endometrium in other areas of the body. But what it actually is endometrial-like. So it's similar to that endometrial tissue, but not quite the same. And in fact, it has evolved into a much more complex thing in the way that it works.
It's so fascinating to learn more about that because, I've done my own research around endo, but literally you expressing that it's not just where we think it is, it's other areas as well. It's just opening your eyes going, oh, okay, there's other areas in my body that, it may be detected there as well. I want us to dive into what it's like to have endo and to improve fertility or having some fertility complications, because I know you're a mum now with twins. And I would love to know, what was your journey to becoming pregnant, to giving birth? I know everyone has their own different stories, but I would love to hear yours.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I am very open in talking about. In fact, I did a whole YouTube series on my IVF journey, and I'm always an open book. Anything that other people are uncomfortable talking about, I will talk about. And this was actually kind of the catalyst to me getting my endo diagnosis, because my ex-husband and I, we started trying to conceive. And that first month of trying to conceive, we were in Greece. We were like, oh, we'll go on this last hurrah, the last holiday before, we have kids. And so we started trying to conceive over there. And when I got back, I swore that I was pregnant because I started bleeding way too early in my cycle. And I thought, oh, it must be implantation bleeding. And long story short, turned out being a rogue period. And I was like, you know what, I think maybe it's time to reopen these investigations. And then I got my endo diagnosis, had my excision surgery, and Russell, being a fertility specialist as well, he's like, everything looked clear. Your tubes are clear. Reproductive structures are great. You should be able to conceive. And on top of that, being a naturopath and taking the very best of the supplements and all those things. But what then happened was, 5-6 months later, still not conceiving. And so I actually said to my ex, I was like, you really need to get a semen analysis done as well. And this is something that I'm really passionate about, is making sure that every person, the male and the female, needs to be investigated, not just the woman. And sure enough, he came back with really low sperm parameters. So we started doing a bit of work on it and trying to budget, and it just was not budging. And then when I went back to Russell, probably about 8 or 9 months later, and said, we're still not conceiving. And I told him about the sperm results, and he was like, he had a look at it and he said, yeah, you're going to have to go through to IVF. So we were relieved at that point because we just wanted to get started. And with all that said, I want to express as well that I do believe, and definitely from what I've seen from working in fertility now, even more so since then, is that we could have improved those sperm parameters possibly without IVF, but it takes a lot of work. When you've got really a poor DNA fragmentation of sperm, it can take a good year to fix those issues, depending where they come from. So I can really empathize why people do decide, I don't want to keep doing that. I just want to go to IVF. And that's, what we did too. So we did the egg collection process, and I was kind of like a poor responder. I got 6 eggs, but we always say it doesn't matter how many eggs you have, it only takes one. And because some people will get 30 eggs in an egg retrieval and none of them progress to embryos or none of them progress to a live birth. So IVF is such a fickle space. And anyway, so we ended up with one viable embryo, and I was devastated because I was like, well, based on the statistics, quite often the first round doesn't work. I'm going to have to do the whole egg collection process again. I was devastated. I was bawling my eyes out. And then sure enough, though, we did the transfer and I got double lucky because it split into 2 and I had ended up with identical twin girls. So it was just such a roller coaster, a wild ride. But then the next thing was I was a high-risk pregnancy, not only are twins high risk, but ones that share the placenta, because there can be issues with uneven blood flow across the placenta where one baby starts to get more and the other one gets less. And sure enough, that is what happened. We developed this rare condition called TAPS, where one becomes anemic and the other one gets all the red blood cells. And so my girls came at 33 weeks. So, basically from the moment of being diagnosed with endo, then going to IVF, then having a high-risk pregnancy, then they were born early. They were in hospital for 3.5 weeks. I had a shit show of a breastfeeding journey, trying so hard to do that. And then the sleep deprivation. And it's been one hell of a journey. But you know what, like the girls are now 2 years and 4 months and it's finally feeling a lot easier. And a lot of people say to me, oh God, terrible twos. Oh, it's going to be hard. I'm like, mate, you have no idea what newborn twins are like. Like this is a walk in the park compared to all the stuff I've been through. But to go back to fertility for endo in general, because, my story is only one story. It's like, tiny representation of how fertility affects endometriosis. And especially, we had a male factor as well, which is very common too. And what can happen with endometriosis and fertility is you've got 2 factors at play. There's the chemical factor where, it's highly inflammatory, which can impair embryonic development, implantation, things like that. But then there can also be a structural component where there may actually be a true blockage impairing the fertility from actually taking place. So it does really depend on those 2 factors. But quite often, a lot of people with endo, I see, not always, but, a lot of people I see structurally when they've had that surgery, they've been told everything anatomically looks perfectly fine. You should be able to conceive. And it's like been 2 or 3 years and they still haven't conceived. Now, of course, again, the male needs to be addressed too. And too often I see where no one's even given a shit about their sperm. And also on top of that, the sperm reference ranges are terrible. So a lot of men are being told that their sperm is fine. And this actually happened to my ex-husband too. And then you have a look at the reference ranges. And so you only have to be, so if you are just above the reference ranges and they tell you, yeah, your sperm looks fine, you might only be in the 5th percentile, meaning that people that fell within that 5th percentile, only 5% of men were able to conceive in that first year with sperm parameters like that. So we actually want to aim for 50th percentile and above. And we know that sperm counts have declined by 60% in the last 60 years, and they are continuing to decline. So the sperm counts that they are now deeming as acceptable are actually abysmal. And so it's no wonder that more and more people are going through infertility. What's even more sad though is that even if, say, it is a male factor, it's still the woman that has to go through all the IVF. They've got to still do injecting themselves with the hormones. They've got to do the egg collection process. And then, basically all the man does is jizz into a cup and give his sample and he's done. Whereas the woman, we go through all these like hormonal changes and the bloating, discomfort, pain. And then, of course, we carry the baby as well. And yeah, it's a little bit frustrating.
It sounds very frustrating. And it's no wonder why it's declining. You made such a good point before about the DNA profile, not just for women, but for men as well. And I want us to talk a little bit about this because you made such a good point that for this, for this long, as women, we're the ones who are carrying all this baggage, around the IVF side of things, like the bloating and the different symptoms. And obviously the man just doesn't get any of that. But you also mentioned how the DNA of the sperm is declining. And I would love to know, why is that happening? I know, but our listeners may not know.
Yeah. So, and what I was referring to there is DNA fragmentation. So it means that the DNA within the sperm has become fragmented and, for lack of a better term, poor quality. And that's not going to allow for, when the sperm meets the egg, that egg is going to actually have to work in overdrive to try and fix the DNA within that sperm. So this is also another kind of thing, and it's not completely diagnostic, but when I'm often working with people with IVF and they tell me, okay, so we had, 10 eggs and 8 of them fertilized and they were all going along well. And then come day 3, all of a sudden they all started to kind of decline. And so the first 3 days of embryonic development has a lot to do with the energy of the egg or the oocyte. So the mitochondria in there is, the batteries of the cells is helping with that embryonic development. And then after a few days, then the energy of the sperm is starting to take over. And then, so if that's really poor and there's poor DNA fragmentation and poor mitochondrial function of the sperm and all those things, then suddenly there can be this real decline and it starts to all taper off. So this is one of the key things that we actually work on when there's poor sperm and or poor eggs is the mitochondrial function. I always say they're like the batteries of your cells. And this is where we often use ubiquinol, which is a really good active form of coenzyme Q10. And there's really good research on this as well. Even IVF clinics are now using it. And so, yeah, we really need to make sure that both the energy of both of those are working. But even when it comes to just DNA fragmentation, this is actually something that is not included on a general semen analysis, and it's an out-of-pocket expense. It can be about $400. So not everyone is going to be able to afford that or want to do that. But sometimes, you might have like kind of poor sperm parameters, but if you have really poor DNA fragmentation, that's not going to be fixed with just, taking some more zinc and vitamin E and glutathione and things. Like, this is a whole life change for a good year sometimes to fix that, because it tells us that there is something significantly wrong in the body that's causing this. Like, is it heavy metal exposure? Is it something to do with that job? Like, do they work in the mines? Are they a mechanic? Like, is there something significantly wrong there? Or could there have been a medication that they were taking or that they are still currently on? Are they heavy smokers and drinkers? And the other issue that's really frustrating is that old mate next door could be a smoker and drinker and they've got 5 kids and had no troubles falling pregnant. But this person who seems to be kind of fit and healthy, they go to the gym regularly, they eat okay, but they probably have a few wines 5 or 6 times a night, and that's enough to tip them over the edge and have poor sperm. And there are some genetic factors too. We know as well that the health of your maternal grandmother impacts the fertility of, so like say my grandma, if she was going through famine at the time that she was pregnant with my mum, or she was exposed, chemical exposure, lived on a farm, pesticides, was it during the war, and there was, all these things that will impact my fertility.
Wow.
Yeah. So because when you think about it, so the eggs in my mum's ovaries were created when she was in my nana's, when she was in utero in my nana, right? So my fertility was already determined at that point. So if her health and her mitochondrial function and her methylation and all of those processes were impaired, then that's my future already determined for my fertility. And I can tell you that my nana was in a very awful situation. She was severely abused by her husband physically. And she actually ended up, she had 4 kids and she was pregnant with her 5th, and actually had to run away and hitchhike to get help because it was that bad. And she ended up being able to go back, rescue most of her kids. Unfortunately, one of them she couldn't get back. And, went away from that. So the trauma of that is so significant. And, my mum has told me things that she witnessed, growing up and things. And that trauma is actually passed on into your offspring. And in fact, I watched an amazing talk by one of our, queens of herbal medicine, Leah Heckman, last year. And she's an absolute queen in the fertility space and things. And she said that there are even studies that show that people that were victims in Auschwitz, their offspring, so those that survived, their offspring eventually also had PTSD, but they hadn't even experienced any trauma.
Yeah.
So, So, all of these traumas and exposures and things like that, sometimes are already predetermined for us. So, but then the question is, well, is there anything that we can still do about it right now? If you still have eggs and you do still have sperm, then yes, there are still things we can do to improve the quality of those. Unfortunately, some of us just get dealt a harder card where we have to work harder on that stuff. But there are still things that we can do. And sometimes it may still mean that IVF is an option, but doesn't mean that there aren't things we can do to improve your IVF outcomes. So, yeah, it's very complex.
It's complex, but it's very fascinating because it gives you a much in-depth picture of everything, because, too often women go into this world wanting to have kids, and then when they're having issues to conceive, or even just having all these fertility issues, they actually think it's a me problem. But as you mentioned, it's from like generations away. And thinking about that and the story about your grandmother, it gives me a lot of reflections of my grandmother as well, who she lost her husband when she was really young. She raised my mum and her brother at a really young age as well, and just lived a really miserable life. Like, she wasn't a happy woman. She was very unhealthy. She ended up dying of cancer. So it's just like, wow, like all these things are kind of like making sense, and like why we're kind of going through the stuff that we're going through. And I was smiling when you mentioned the story about those who survived World War II, the Holocaust, because I've done a lot of study around that. Like, I absolutely love studying that side of things, and especially because part of my family survived that generation. So it kind of makes sense why so many of them still have that form of PTSD, even though they weren't even like back there. It was just from their own like generation. So it's absolutely fascinating to know that.
Oh God. When you start diving into this area, it is like, it's a bit mind boggling, and you just keep going down this rabbit hole and you can't get off it. And you're just like, oh my God, where do I even begin? And sometimes it's like, okay, sometimes it's useful to understand this stuff because it evolves our knowledge and helps us understand where things are coming from. It's also validating because it can help us realize it's nothing I did. But sometimes also, does it change our treatment? Not always. sometimes it's like, well, at the end of the day, though, we can still do some things to address this. But I also think, trauma is an area that absolutely needs to be a part of most people's treatment plans. And even if it's trauma that we've all experienced throughout life, we have small T traumas and big T traumas. And a lot of people only associate trauma with big T traumas, car accident, being in the war, things like that. Whereas little T traumas are still traumas on the nervous system, and they get captured in our nervous system, and they set up the way that our nervous system reacts to things in life. And if we don't go back and address those traumas by doing, say, somatic trauma healing and things like that, then our nervous system will forever be reacting in that way to things. And that will impact our health in every way. And so we need to be addressing that. And it's something that I certainly wasn't addressing enough until not even it's really been the last year, even after going through my separation, because I dived into my own traumas and things like that. I was like, wow, there's some really powerful stuff in this. And I think everyone needs to be addressing it.
100%. What are some things that have helped you address, those side of things for you?
Yeah. So I was actually reflecting on this recently. I have truly gone through the biggest transformation in myself personally in the last probably 6 months. And I often say, even though going through a separation isn't an easy thing, and not anyone, people don't want to go through that, but it actually can also be one of the greatest gifts, because it forces you to really reflect on how can you work on yourself. And so a couple of key things. One thing for me is I did do a somatic trauma healing session recently, about 4 months ago. And I was very lucky that, this woman, Savita, she actually lives in one of the chalets on my mum and dad's property in WA. And mum and dad were telling me she's a trauma healer. I was like, oh, no way, I want to see her. And I just felt like it was one of those divine timing things. And I went and had a session with her. And we actually went back to when I was 13 years old in this session. And so basically she gets you really relaxed on the table. And even I was just thinking, is this all this is, just getting me relaxed and doing deep breathing? Because I've done this plenty of times. But obviously she needed me to feel really, really relaxed and safe, because we were about to go back to a place that might not be as comfortable. With that said, it's not about trying to reopen old wounds, but it's about getting you back to this place, feeling really supported and safe, and then recreate that narrative a little bit. So, we got into a really relaxed space. Oh, and before that, obviously, I had talked about a few things that have happened in my life. And one of those that she ended up wanting to work with was that when I was 13, I was in a relationship with this guy who was 19. So already that's a red flag. But on top of that, he was very possessive and very controlling. And so for a 13/14-year-old to go through this at one of the most important parts of your life is just, it can completely change the course of your life. And, he was very jealous. He wouldn't let me see my friends. If I talked to a guy, suddenly I was a slut. He wouldn't let me wear certain clothes. And at one point he did get physical. And so in this somatic trauma healing session, we went back to when I was 13. It's not that we faced any of those traumatic events, but more so when I was 13, what did I need to hear? Who were the people that I actually needed to hold me and make me feel safe and secure enough to not put up with something like that? And so she actually got me to bring in, the closest people to me. So my best friends, Karen and Carly. So they were kind of there with me energetically, if you know what I mean. And she was like, they are with you here. What do they need to tell you? And then also she was like, you're here with your 13-year-old self. So your 32-year-old self is here with your 13-year-old self. What does she need from you right now? What does she need you to tell her? And so she was, guiding me through this, and I'm saying out loud, I'm like, she needs me to know that I'm here for her and all these things. And tears were just streaming down my face. And I've never gone back to that moment, and I revisited it in that way until then. And suddenly my breath was just much more slower and deeper, and I was just so much more relaxed. And the other, actually probably the most profound thing that she said, so simple but so profound, because in the pre-chat before we started the session, one of the other things I said to her is that growing up, I was always known to be very mature for my age. And even though back then it was like, oh, it's such a great thing to be proud of, but now psychologically I realize that's not necessarily a good thing. Like, why are you being a people pleaser? Why are you being the good girl? Why are you being quiet and like trying to do what you think people want of you? Where's that coming from? And so in the session, when we're deep in this healing phase, she goes, and tell her she doesn't need to be mature for her age. And that just like hit home. And I was like, oh my God, that's it right there. That's the groundbreaking moment. Like, I was meant to be living my life as the age that I was and not trying to be something else. So long story short, after that, I just felt like I could breathe better all of a sudden. And I just felt so relaxed and at peace. And yeah, it was really life-changing. And I'm telling you, from that point forward, I've been a different person ever since. I feel like I've got better boundaries. I'm not trying to be a people pleaser as much anymore. And you still got to work on it. There's always still things you got to work through. And there's heaps of other things that I'm doing as well. And just even getting in touch with my spiritual side more and more. And I've become really passionate about mushrooms and medicinal mushrooms and mushroom hunting and foraging and all those things. And even that's been very healing as well. So there's so many aspects that you can do and work on yourself.
I could sense that relief in you once you said this story, because you literally took a deep breath in and just relaxed. And it's such a profound feeling to have after certain experiences, whether it's through somatic work or whether it's through meditation or journaling or speaking to just like talk therapy, just to be able to find the reasoning behind the pain that we've been holding on for so long. And I know a lot of our listeners will be resonating with this, because for so many years, from a really young age, I know I can resonate with this, is I was trying to be someone that I wasn't, to please everyone else, putting a fucking mask on, be like, I am the mature Siggy, here I am. But now these days I'm like, I just want to be myself. Like, if you don't like me, good. Like, see you later. So yeah, it's beautiful to witness how it has helped you to shaped of who you are for like the past 6 months, and having that transition, especially after everything that you've been through.
Oh, absolutely. Even this year, I was diagnosed with ADHD as well. And even that's been extremely validating. And there's so many misconceptions. And even I used to hold a lot of them as well on what ADHD is. And personally, I feel like it's excelled me in many ways, because it's that kind of, it allows you to hyperfixate on things and be very efficient at certain things. Sure, there's also the negative sides where you get distracted easily. Often you are a people pleaser and you can get in your head, and there are all these other things. But even just that alone, like just getting to know yourself and giving yourself permission to be your weird and wonderful self. And like, I think, the most groundbreaking thing for me was to finally just stop giving a shit about what anyone else thinks. And, imposter syndrome is still something that creeps its way in all the time. But more and more now I can turn that volume down, and I'm like, I don't give a fuck about what that person says. I'm just not here to please you anymore. I'm done with you. Like, even if it's just a voice in your head. And the reality is there are so many people that need to hear your message, and they need to hear you show up as the most authentic version of you. They don't need you to try and be someone else. They're not going to actually resonate with you anywhere near as much if you try and do that anyway.
100%. I completely agree with that. And what a way to finish today's episode, from us talking about your journey to endo, talking about fertility, talking about painful sex, to now we're talking about fucking mushroom somatic experiences. I absolutely love conversations like these, because they literally go from one end to the other. Whenever we have people listening, they're like, I was expecting this to just be about period health, and now you're talking about this. I'm like, you're welcome. Hey,
we're only getting started.
I know, right? Seriously, like we could probably do another episode of talking about the ADHD side of things, talking about mushrooms, but I want to keep it very nice and short for today. Do you have any final messages for our listeners?
There's so many messages I want to choose, but I think off the back of two things. Obviously, if we're going back to the endometriosis stuff and you've related to any of these things today in terms of symptoms, then go join my Facebook group. That's probably the best thing you can do, the Natural Medicine for Endometriosis. Check out the files and go get an expert opinion. That's really, really important. And of course, if you do want some naturopathic support, there's my team as well. Just go to jadewalker.com.au. Everything's there. And I've got my course, the Endo Care Collective. But then the other stuff that we're talking about now on this different path, honestly, just start showing up and being yourself, and stop giving a shit about what that person said to you 2 years ago that still affects you now. Like, they're never going to be happy. They're never going to be pleased. Like, the sooner you start showing up as your authentic self, the better your life is going to get. And you're going to start attracting the same kinds of people. Like, pretty much all of my friends have ADHD now, like, because we all get along so well, and we can like go on these weird tangent conversations where we like have talked about 10 different unfinished topics, but it doesn't matter because we'll get to it later. Like, and it's awesome. We thrive off it, but we also understand each other when we're like, hey, I'm in the pits of it today. I've got no spoons today. And it's like, yeah, sweet, take your time. We understand each other. So that's my message to leave on.
I love that. What a good fucking message to end with. Girls, thank you. And men and whoever's listening, thank you so much for tuning in to today's podcast. If you did enjoy it, please make sure that you screenshot it, tag us at the Women's Fitness Academy, tag myself, tag Jade. And then till next time, let's take a little bit more conscious care of our mental and our physical well-being.